The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Windsor Castle as 10-year-old Prince George walked quietly beside his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II. The young prince had always found comfort in these early morning walks, when the castle was still peaceful and the only sounds were their footsteps on the ancient stone paths and the distant chirping of birds in the royal gardens. Prince George was not like other children his age. While his classmates at school were worried about homework and playground games, he carried the weight of knowing that one day he would become King of England. This knowledge made him thoughtful beyond his years. And today, something was clearly troubling him. The Queen noticed her grandson's unusual silence. Usually, during their walks, George would chatter about his lessons, ask questions about the history of the castle, or share stories about his younger siblings, Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis. But today, he walked with his hands clasped behind his back, his small face serious and contemplative. "What's on your mind, my dear boy?" the Queen asked gently, slowing her pace to match his shorter steps. Prince George looked up at her with those piercing blue eyes that reminded everyone of his great-grandfather, Prince Philip. "Granny, I've been thinking about something that happened yesterday," he said, his voice carrying a maturity that sometimes surprised even his family. They had reached the rose garden, where the Queen's favorite bench sat beneath a centuries-old oak tree. She gestured for them to sit down, and George climbed up beside her, his legs swinging slightly as they didn't quite reach the ground. "Tell me what happened," the Queen encouraged, her voice warm and patient. George took a deep breath before beginning his story. "Yesterday, when Papa took me to visit the barracks where the royal guards train, I saw something that made me feel very sad and angry at the same time. The previous day had been meant as an educational visit. Prince William had arranged for George to observe the training and daily routines of the guards who protected the royal family. It was part of George's gradual introduction to understanding the many people who served the crown and the responsibility that came with their dedication. The visit had started wonderfully. George had been fascinated watching the guards practice their ceremonial drills, their red uniforms bright against the gray stone of the training grounds. The precision of their movements, the way they could stand perfectly still for hours, and their unwavering dedication to their duty impressed the young prince greatly. Colonel Matthews, a distinguished officer with silver hair and kind eyes, had been their guide for the day. He explained to George how each guard underwent months of rigorous training, not just in military skills but in protocol, history, and the sacred duty of protecting the royal family. "These men and women," Colonel Matthews had explained, "consider it the highest honor to serve your family, your Royal Highness. They would gladly give their lives to protect you, your parents, and your grandparents." George had nodded solemnly, understanding even at his young age the gravity of such devotion. But it was during their tour of the guards' quarters that something happened that would stay with him long after they returned to the palace. They had entered a large room where several guards were taking their break between training sessions. Most of the guards immediately stood at attention when they noticed the prince and his father. But George's attention was drawn to a corner where he heard raised voices. Sergeant Davies, a tall man with a permanent scowl, was speaking harshly to a younger guard named James. James appeared to be new to the regiment, perhaps only recently graduated from training. He stood rigidly at attention while Sergeant Davies circled him like a predator. "You're a disgrace to this uniform," Sergeant Davies was saying, his voice loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. "Your boots aren't polished properly. Your posture is slouched. And you move during the morning drill. In my 20 years of service, I've never seen such incompetence." James's face was red, but whether from embarrassment, anger, or the effort of holding back tears, it was hard to tell. The other guards in the room looked uncomfortable, some staring at their feet, others finding sudden interest in their equipment. "Perhaps," Sergeant Davies continued, his voice dripping with contempt, "you should consider finding a different career. The Royal Guard is no place for weaklings who can't handle a little pressure." Prince George felt his stomach twist as he watched the scene unfold. Even at 10 years old, he could recognize bullying when he saw it. This wasn't the kind of firm but fair discipline he'd learned about in his history lessons or heard described by his father and grandfather. This was cruelty disguised as training. Colonel Matthews, who had also noticed the situation, quickly steered Prince William and George away from the scene, but the image of James standing there, trying so hard to maintain his composure while being publicly humiliated, stayed with George for the rest of the visit. Later, as they toured other parts of the barracks, George couldn't stop thinking about what he'd witnessed. He found himself studying the faces of the other guards, wondering how many of them had experienced similar treatment from Sergeant Davies. He noticed how some of the younger guards seemed nervous and tense, their eyes darting around as if constantly worried about making a mistake. During the formal demonstration that concluded their visit, George's attention kept returning to James, who stood in the back row of guards. Despite everything that had happened earlier, James maintained perfect posture and performed his duties flawlessly. There was something about his determination and dignity that impressed George deeply. As they prepared to leave, George overheard a conversation between two guards near the entrance. "Davies has been getting worse lately," one was saying quietly. "Yesterday he made Thompson stand in the rain for 3 hours because his salute was a fraction of a second too slow. Someone needs to report him," the other guard replied. "But who's going to risk their career? Davies has connections, and he's been here forever. It's not right, though. This isn't what serving the crown should be about. We're supposed to be protecting the royal family with honor and pride, not living in fear of our own sergeants." These words echoed in George's mind as he told his grandmother about the experience. The Queen listened intently, her expression growing more serious as the story continued. "What troubles me most, Granny," George said, his voice small but determined, "is that these people are supposed to be protecting us. But some of them are being hurt by their own leaders. How can someone who's cruel to his own men truly understand what it means to serve with honor?" The Queen was quiet for a long moment, studying her grandson's earnest face. She had always known that George possessed an unusual sensitivity and wisdom for his age, but this situation showed a depth of understanding that impressed even her. "You're quite right to be troubled by what you saw," she said finally. "True leadership is never about intimidation or cruelty. It's about inspiring others to be their best selves while treating them with dignity and respect." George nodded, then looked up at her with hopeful eyes. "Do you think there's something we could do to help James and the other guards who are being treated badly?" The Queen smiled at her grandson's compassion. "What do you think we should do?" George had clearly been thinking about this question. "Well," he said, choosing his words carefully, "I know that as future king, I'll need to learn how to help people who can't help themselves. Maybe this could be a chance for me to practice. But I'd need your help, and Papa's help too." The Queen was struck by the maturity of George's response. Here was a 10-year-old boy who had witnessed injustice and, instead of simply feeling bad about it, was looking for ways to make things better. It reminded her of her own father, King George VI, who had always believed that true nobility came from service to others. "I think," the Queen said, "that we should speak with your father about this situation. But I want you to understand something important, George. When we have the power to help others, we also have the responsibility to use that power wisely and carefully." George nodded solemnly. "I understand, Granny. We can't just charge in and demand changes without knowing all the facts and thinking about the best way to help." As they walked back toward the castle, the Queen reflected on how proud she was of her grandson. Many children his age would have forgotten about the incident by now, distracted by toys or games. But George's sense of justice and compassion were clearly integral parts of who he was becoming. That evening, after dinner, George approached his father in the study. Prince William was reviewing some documents when his son knocked quietly on the door. "Papa, could I talk to you about something important?" William set aside his papers and gestured for George to come in. "Of course, George. What's on your mind?" George repeated the story he'd told his grandmother, but this time he went into even more detail about what he'd observed. He described the expressions on the faces of the other guards, the way the room had felt tense and uncomfortable, and his growing conviction that something needed to be done. Prince William listened carefully, occasionally asking questions to clarify what George had seen. As the story unfolded, William's expression grew more serious. He had heard rumors about Sergeant Davies over the years, but nothing concrete enough to act upon. Hearing about it from George's perspective, however, shed new light on the situation. "I'm proud of you for bringing this to my attention," William said when George finished. "It takes courage to speak up about injustice, especially when it doesn't directly affect you." George shifted in his chair. "But it does affect me, Papa. These guards are risking their lives to protect our family. Don't we owe it to them to make sure they're treated with the same respect and dignity that they show us?" William was amazed by his son's insight. "You're absolutely right, George. Tell me, what do you think we should do about this situation?" George had clearly given this considerable thought. "I think we need to learn more about what's really happening. Maybe we could visit the barracks again, but this time without announcing it ahead of time. If Sergeant Davies knew we were coming, he probably acted differently than he normally does." William nodded. "That's a very good point. An unannounced visit would give us a more accurate picture of the daily atmosphere there. And," George continued, gaining confidence, "maybe we could find a way to talk to some of the guards privately so they could tell us the truth without worrying about getting in trouble." William was impressed by George's strategic thinking. "Those are excellent suggestions. But I want you to understand that if we do discover that there are serious problems, addressing them might take time. We'll need to be careful to gather proper evidence and follow the right procedures." George nodded eagerly. "I understand, Papa. But the important thing is that we try to help, right?" That night, as George lay in bed, he thought about James and the other guards who might be suffering under Sergeant Davies's harsh treatment. He imagined what it would feel like to dedicate your life to serving others, only to be constantly criticized and humiliated by someone in authority. George had always been taught that with privilege came responsibility. His parents had worked hard to ensure that he understood the weight of his future role as king, not as a burden, but as an opportunity to make a positive difference in people's lives. This situation with the Royal Guards felt like his first real chance to put those lessons into practice. As he drifted off to sleep, George made a silent promise to himself that he would do whatever he could to help ensure that the brave men and women who protected his family were treated with the honor and respect they deserved. He didn't yet know how he would accomplish this, but he was determined to find a way. The next morning brought new possibilities, and the beginning of what would become a defining moment in young Prince George's understanding of leadership, compassion, and the true meaning of royal duty. 3 days after his conversation with his father, Prince George found himself once again walking through the corridors that led to the Royal Guards barracks. This time, however, the visit was unannounced and informal. Prince William had arranged it to appear as though they were simply taking a different route during their usual morning exercise, which would naturally lead them past the training facilities. The morning air was crisp, and George could hear the sound of marching feet and shouted commands echoing from the courtyard ahead. As they approached the main training area, George felt a mixture of nervousness and determination churning in his stomach. He knew that what they might witness today could be very different from the carefully orchestrated visit he had experienced earlier. Prince William placed a gentle hand on his son's shoulder as they paused just outside the entrance to the barracks. "Remember, George," he said quietly, "we're here to observe and learn. Don't feel like you need to react to anything you see right away. We'll discuss it afterward." Track 2. "Will all of the 22-4, George nodded, understanding that his father was preparing him for the possibility that they might witness more of Sergeant Davies's harsh treatment of the guards. As they stepped into the building, the familiar sounds of military training filled the air. But there was something different about the atmosphere today. In the main training hall, they could see Sergeant Davies conducting a drill with a group of new recruits. His voice boomed across the room as he barked orders, but even from a distance, George could sense the tension in the air. The young guards stood at rigid attention, but their faces showed signs of stress and anxiety rather than the confident alertness that George had expected to see. As they moved closer, staying in the shadows near the entrance to avoid being immediately noticed, George could hear more clearly what was happening. "You call that a proper salute, Rodriguez?" Sergeant Davies was shouting at a young woman who couldn't have been much older than 20. "My grandmother could salute better than that, and she's been dead for 15 years. The other recruits stood perfectly still, but George could see the embarrassment and anger flickering across their faces. Rodriguez's cheeks were bright red, but she maintained her position and repeated the salute with perfect precision. "Better," Davies sneered, "but still not good enough. Give me 50 push-ups. And while you're down there, think about whether you really belong in the Queen's Guard, or if you should go back to whatever village you came from." George felt his hands clench into fists at his sides. He looked up at his father and saw that Prince William's jaw was set in a hard line. They both recognized that this was not the kind of firm but fair training that built character and discipline. This was systematic humiliation designed to break down the recruits' confidence rather than build them up. As Rodriguez began her push-ups, Davies turned his attention to another recruit, a young man whose name tag read, Patel. "And you, Patel," Davies continued, his voice dripping with disdain, "I suppose you think that because you graduated top of your class at Sandhurst, you don't need to follow the same rules as everyone else?" Patel looked confused. "Sir, I don't understand. I believe I've followed all protocols correctly. Don't play dumb with me," Davies snapped. "Your weapon wasn't cleaned properly this morning. I could see fingerprints on the barrel from across the room." George watched as Patel's face showed genuine bewilderment. From where he stood, George could clearly see that Patel's rifle was immaculate, polished to a mirror shine like all the others. It was obvious that Davies was inventing problems where none existed. "Sir, I spent 45 minutes cleaning my weapon this morning," Patel said respectfully but firmly. "I've followed the exact procedures we were taught." Davies stepped closer to Patel, invading his personal space in a way that was clearly meant to intimidate. "Are you questioning my judgment, recruit?" "No, sir," Patel replied. But his voice carried a note of frustration that he was clearly struggling to suppress. "I think you are," Davies said with a cold smile. "I think you believe that your fancy education makes you better than the rest of us. Well, let me tell you something, university boy. In my unit, your degree means nothing. Your family connections mean nothing. All that matters is whether you can follow orders without question." George noticed that several of the other guards had stopped what they were doing and were watching the confrontation with obvious discomfort. Some looked angry. Others seemed resigned, as if they had witnessed similar scenes many times before. It was then that George spotted James, the guard he had seen being humiliated during his first visit. James was standing with a group of more experienced guards near the equipment storage area, and George could see the conflict playing out on his face as he watched Davies continue his verbal assault on the new recruits. James took a step forward, and for a moment George thought he might intervene, but then another guard grabbed his arm and shook his head slightly. A clear warning that getting involved would only make things worse for everyone. Prince William had seen enough. He stepped out of the shadows and cleared his throat loudly, causing the entire room to freeze in surprised attention. Every guard immediately snapped to attention and saluted as they recognized the Prince of Wales. "Your Royal Highness," Davies called out, his entire demeanor changing instantly. The harsh, bullying tone disappeared, replaced by an overly enthusiastic attempt at military bearing. "What an unexpected honor. We weren't expecting a visit today." "Clearly," Prince William replied, his voice cool and controlled. "Please, continue with your training. We don't want to interrupt." But of course, the damage was already done. With royalty present, Davies couldn't continue his abusive behavior, and the atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically. The recruits who had been looking stressed and demoralized just moments before now stood with proper military bearing, while Davies launched into an elaborate explanation of the day's training objectives. George watched this transformation with fascination and growing anger. It was obvious that Davies was putting on a performance, acting like a completely different person now that he was being observed by someone who could end his career. The contrast between his current behavior and what they had just witnessed was stark and telling. After about 20 minutes of watching the suddenly professional training session, Prince William announced that they would continue with their walk. As they prepared to leave, George noticed that James was looking directly at him with an expression that seemed to convey both hope and resignation. On impulse, George made a decision that would surprise everyone, including himself. He stepped away from his father and walked directly toward James. "Excuse me," George said politely, his young voice carrying clearly across the room. "I'm sorry to interrupt, "But could I speak with you for a moment?" The entire room went silent. Davies's face went pale, clearly wondering what the young prince might want to discuss with one of his subordinates. James looked startled, but immediately stepped forward and saluted. "Of course, Your Royal Highness," James replied, his voice steady despite his obvious surprise. George looked around the room and realized that everyone was listening. He knew that whatever he said now would be heard by Davies and all the other guards, which meant he had to be very careful with his words. "I wanted to thank you," George said, speaking clearly so everyone could hear. "When we visited last week, I was very impressed by your dedication and professionalism. It's clear that you take your duty to protect my family very seriously. And I want you to know that your service is appreciated." James's face showed surprise and gratitude, but George wasn't finished. "I've been learning about the history of the Royal Guard," George continued. "And I know that the greatest leaders in military history have always been those who inspire their soldiers through respect and encouragement, not through fear or intimidation. The guards who have served my family best have always been those who felt proud of their service and confident in their abilities." The room remained absolutely silent, but George could feel the tension in the air. His words were clearly directed not just at James, but at everyone present, including Davies. "I hope," George concluded, "that everyone here feels proud to wear their uniform and knows that their dedication to duty is recognized and valued." James's eyes were bright as he replied, "Thank you, Your Royal Highness. It means more than you know to hear those words." As George walked back to his father, he could feel Davies's eyes boring into him. The sergeant's face was a mixture of confusion, anger, and worry. He clearly understood that the young prince's words had been a deliberate message, but he wasn't sure exactly what it meant for him. Prince William placed a proud hand on George's shoulder as they left the barracks. "That was very well done," he said quietly. "You managed to show support for the guards who deserve it, while also sending a clear message about the standards we expect." As they walked back toward the castle, George felt a sense of accomplishment, but also a growing determination that this was just the beginning. He had taken his first step in addressing the situation, but he knew that much more would need to be done to ensure lasting change. That afternoon, Prince William made several discreet phone calls. He spoke with Colonel Matthews, the officer who had guided their first tour, and asked for a private meeting to discuss some concerns about training methods. He also reached out to other senior military officials who oversaw the Royal Guard, carefully framing his inquiries as part of his ongoing interest in the welfare of those who served the royal family. Meanwhile, George found himself thinking constantly about the guards he had met and the obvious fear they lived with under Davies's command. He imagined what it would be like to come to work every day knowing that you might be publicly humiliated for the smallest mistake, or even for problems that didn't actually exist. That evening, as the family gathered for dinner, George surprised everyone by bringing up the topic of leadership during their conversation. "Mama," he said to Catherine, "how do you know if someone in charge is doing a good job?" Catherine exchanged a glance with William before answering. "Well, I think good leaders make the people around them feel confident and capable. They help others become the best versions of themselves." "And what about bad leaders?" George pressed. "Bad leaders," Catherine said thoughtfully, "often rule through fear. They make people afraid to make mistakes, which actually makes everyone perform worse, not better." George nodded seriously. "That makes sense. If you're always worried about being punished, you probably can't focus properly on doing your job well." Princess Charlotte, who was listening to the conversation with interest, added, "Like mean teachers at school, the teachers everyone likes best are the ones who help you when you make mistakes, not the ones who just tell you you're wrong." George smiled at his sister's insight. "Exactly, Charlotte. Being strict is different from being mean." Later that night, George lay in bed thinking about the events of the day and planning what he hoped would be his next steps. He had made his first move by publicly praising James and subtly criticizing Davies's methods. But he knew that real change would require more than just one conversation. George was beginning to understand that leadership wasn't just about having power or authority. It was about how you chose to use that power to make life better for the people who depended on you. The guards protecting his family deserved to be led with honor and respect, and George was determined to find a way to ensure that happened. 2 weeks had passed since Prince George's unexpected conversation with James at the barracks. During those days, Prince William had been quietly conducting his own investigation into the culture and leadership within the Royal Guard. What he discovered confirmed George's observations and revealed a pattern of behavior that went far beyond what they had initially witnessed. Colonel Matthews had been extremely cooperative when William approached him about his concerns. The colonel admitted that there had been multiple complaints about Sergeant Davies over the years, but the military's traditional chain of command and Davies's long service record had made it difficult to take action without concrete evidence. "The truth is, Your Royal Highness," Colonel Matthews had confided during their private meeting, "many of us have been concerned about Davies's methods for some time. But the culture in military units can be very insular, and younger guards are often reluctant to report problems because they fear it will damage their careers." William had also spoken with several other officers who oversaw different aspects of the Royal Guard's training and operations. Each conversation revealed the same pattern. Davies was known for his harsh treatment of subordinates, but he was also skilled at hiding his behavior when senior officials were present. Meanwhile, George had been thinking deeply about the situation and had come up with what he believed might be a solution. His idea was simple, but potentially powerful, and he was eager to discuss it with his father. On a rainy Thursday morning, George knocked on the door of his father's study. Prince William was reviewing some documents related to his royal duties, but he immediately set them aside when he saw his son's serious expression. "Papa, I've been thinking about the guards and Sergeant Davies," George began, settling into the chair across from his father's desk. "I have an idea, but I want to know what you think before we do anything." William leaned back in his chair, impressed as always by his son's thoughtful approach to problems. "I'd like to hear your idea, George." George took a deep breath before beginning. "Well, I was thinking about what Granny always says about leading by example. She says that when people see the royal family behaving in a certain way, it influences how they think they should behave too." William nodded, curious to see where this was leading. "So I was thinking," George continued, "what if I asked to spend a day training with the guards? Not just visiting and watching, but actually participating in their exercises and training sessions. If Sergeant Davies treats people badly when he thinks no one important is watching, maybe he wouldn't be able to do that if a member of the royal family was right there training alongside his soldiers." William was quiet for a moment, considering the implications of George's suggestion. It was certainly unconventional, but it also showed a remarkable understanding of how to use royal influence in a positive way. "That's a very creative idea," William said slowly. "But you understand that it would be quite challenging physically? The Guard's training is designed for grown men and women, not 10-year-old boys." George nodded eagerly. "I know I couldn't do everything they do, but I could try to do the parts that are appropriate for my age. And even if I couldn't keep up with all the physical training, I could still be there, observing and participating as much as possible." William was struck by the maturity of George's thinking. "And you believe that your presence during training would help improve the environment for the guards?" "I think it might," George replied. "It would be hard for Sergeant Davies to bully people if I was standing right there. And it would also show all the guards that our family really cares about their welfare and wants to understand what their daily experience is like." The more William thought about it, the more he realized that George's idea had real merit. It would certainly send a powerful message about the royal family's commitment to those who served them, and it would make it very difficult for Davies to continue his abusive behavior. "There would need to be careful planning," William said. "We'd have to make sure it was safe for you, and we'd need to coordinate with the military leadership to ensure that your participation was appropriate and meaningful." George's eyes lit up with excitement. "Does that mean you think it's a good idea?" "I think," William said with a smile, "that it's the kind of idea that could make a real difference. Let me discuss it with Colonel Matthews and see how we might make it work." The conversation with Colonel Matthews took place the next day. When William explained George's proposal, the colonel's initial reaction was surprise, followed quickly by admiration. "I must say, Your Royal Highness, the young prince's idea is quite remarkable," Matthews said. In all my years of military service, I've never heard of a member of the royal family requesting to participate directly in training exercises. What do you think of the practical aspects? William asked. Could it be done safely and appropriately? Matthews considered this carefully. I believe it could, with proper modifications to accommodate His Royal Highness's age. We could design a training program that would allow the prince to participate meaningfully while ensuring his safety. And frankly, the impact on morale and behavior could be extraordinary. They spent the next hour planning the details. It was decided that George would spend a full day with the guards, participating in morning exercises, weapons training appropriate for his age, ceremonial drills, and meals in the guards' mess hall. The goal was to give him as complete an experience as possible of what daily life was like for the soldiers who protected his family. When George learned that his idea had been approved, he was thrilled but also nervous. He understood that this was a significant responsibility and that his behavior during the training would send important messages to everyone involved. The night before the training day, George had trouble sleeping. He kept thinking about James and the other guards who had been suffering under Davies's harsh treatment, and he felt the weight of knowing that this might be his chance to make a real difference in their lives. The morning of the training arrived gray and cold, with a light mist hanging over the castle grounds. George dressed in the special training uniform that had been prepared for him, a modified version of the guard's standard gear, adjusted for his size and age, but still recognizably similar to what the soldiers wore. When George arrived at the barracks, accompanied by his father and 2 personal protection officers, the atmosphere was unlike anything he had experienced during his previous visits. Word had spread through the ranks that the young prince would be training with them for the day, and the excitement and nervousness among the guards was palpable. Colonel Matthews met them at the entrance and escorted George to the main training hall, where about 30 guards were assembled for the morning exercises. George recognized many faces from his previous visits, including James, who gave him an encouraging smile. Sergeant Davies was also present, and George noticed immediately that the man seemed unusually tense and uncertain. It was clear that the prospect of having the young prince participate directly in his training session had thrown Davies off balance. "Your Royal Highness," Davies said, his voice carefully controlled, "it's an honor to have you join our training today. We've prepared a special program that we hope will be both educational and engaging for you." ASCO. George looked Davies directly in the eyes and replied, "Thank you, Sergeant Davies. I'm looking forward to learning about what daily life is like for the brave men and women who protect my family. I want to understand exactly what you all go through." The emphasis George placed on the word "exactly" was subtle but unmistakable, and Davies clearly understood the implication. The morning began with physical exercises. George couldn't match the strength and endurance of the adult guards, but he participated enthusiastically in modified versions of their calisthenics, running exercises, and strength training. More importantly, he was right there among the guards, experiencing the same commands and expectations. What struck George most was how different the atmosphere was from what he had witnessed during his unannounced visit. With the prince participating in the exercises, Davies's usual harsh criticism and public humiliation were completely absent. Instead, the sergeant's instructions were professional, constructive, and respectful. During one exercise, a young recruit named Thompson made a small mistake in the timing of a drill. George watched carefully to see how Davies would respond. Instead of the verbal assault that George had witnessed before, Davies simply called out, "Thompson, remember to count the beats more carefully. Let's try it again." The contrast was remarkable, and George could see the relief and gratitude on Thompson's face as he corrected the mistake without being humiliated in front of his colleagues. As the morning progressed, George found opportunities to interact directly with the guards during breaks between exercises. He made sure to speak with as many of them as possible, asking about their experiences, their backgrounds, and their feelings about their service. During one break, he approached James directly. "I remember meeting you during my first visit," George said. "How are you finding life in the guards?" James glanced around to make sure Davies was out of earshot before answering. "It's been challenging, Your Royal Highness. But today has been different. Better." George understood exactly what James meant, without needing further explanation. Later in the morning, The training moved to weapons handling. George was taught basic rifle safety and handling procedures, appropriate for his age and size. Again, he noticed that Davies's instruction was patient and professional, completely unlike the intimidating and demeaning approach he had used when he thought he wasn't being observed by royal family members. The most significant moment of the day came during the lunch break. All the guards ate together in the mess hall, and George insisted on going through the same serving line and eating the same food as everyone else. As they sat around the long tables, George engaged in conversation with guards of all ranks, asking about their homes, their families, and their aspirations. It was during this informal time that one of the younger guards, emboldened by the prince's approachable manner, made a comment that would prove to be pivotal. "Your Royal Highness," the guard said quietly, "I just want to say that having you here today has shown us what it really means to be treated with respect and dignity. It's made me proud to wear this uniform in a way I hadn't felt in a while." George understood the deeper meaning behind these words. The guard was telling him that the respectful treatment he had witnessed today was not the norm, and that the prince's presence had created an environment where the guards could remember why they had chosen to serve in the first place. After lunch, George participated in ceremonial drill training, learning the precise movements and timing that the guards used during public appearances and official functions. Again, Davies's instruction was professional and encouraging, but George could sense the underlying tension in the man's demeanor. As the afternoon continued, George began to understand something important about power and its effects on people's behavior. Davies wasn't necessarily evil or malicious. He was someone who had been allowed to abuse his authority when he thought no one was watching. The presence of royal oversight had completely transformed his behavior, proving that the problem was not just individual character but also lack of accountability. This realization helped George formulate a plan for ensuring lasting change rather than just temporary improvement. As the training day drew to a close, Colonel Matthews assembled all the guards for a brief ceremony. George was invited to address the group, and he had prepared his words carefully. "I want to thank all of you for allowing me to train with you today," George began, his young voice carrying clearly across the room. "I have learned more about the dedication and sacrifice required for your service than I ever understood before." He paused, looking around the room at the faces of the guards, many of whom were hanging on his every word. "I want you to know that your service to my family is not just appreciated but deeply respected. You have chosen to dedicate your lives to protecting others, which is one of the noblest callings anyone can have. You deserve to be treated with the same honor and dignity that you show to those you protect." George's eyes briefly met Davies's as he continued. "I also want you to know that my family takes a personal interest in your welfare and your working conditions. We believe that those who serve with honor should be led with honor." The message was clear, and Davies's face showed that he understood exactly what the young prince was saying. "Finally," George concluded, "I want to let you know that this will not be my only visit. I plan to return regularly to continue learning from all of you, and to ensure that the high standards of respect and professionalism I witnessed today continue to be the norm." Resuited, the applause that followed was genuine and enthusiastic, and George could see hope and relief on many faces. As they prepared to leave, George made a point of shaking hands with every guard present, including Davies. When he reached the sergeant, George looked him directly in the eyes and said, "Thank you for your professional instruction today, Sergeant Davies. I look forward to seeing the same high standards maintained in all future training sessions." Davies's response was formal and correct, but George could see the understanding in his eyes. The sergeant knew that his behavior was being closely monitored, and that any return to his previous abusive methods would have serious consequences. 2 weeks later, George kept his promise and returned for another training session. This time, he arrived unannounced and found that the professional, respectful atmosphere he had experienced during his first participation had indeed been maintained. Over the following months, George continued to make regular visits to the barracks, sometimes announced and sometimes not. Each time, he found that the culture among the guards continued to improve. Morale was higher, performance was better, and the fear and tension that had previously characterized life under Davies's command had been replaced by pride and confidence. James, the guard who had first caught George's attention, was eventually promoted to corporal, and later became one of the prince's personal protection officers. In that role, he often spoke to George about how much the prince's intervention had meant to him and his colleagues. "You saved my career, Your Royal Highness," James said during one of their conversations. "More than that, you reminded all of us why we chose this service in the first place." Sergeant Davies, meanwhile, gradually adapted to the new expectations for his behavior. While he never became warm or particularly personable, he learned to provide firm but fair leadership that built up his soldiers rather than tearing them down. The change wasn't immediate or easy, but the constant knowledge that his methods were being observed by those who could end his career proved to be an effective motivation for improvement. Years later, as Prince George grew older and took on more royal responsibilities, he would often reflect on this early experience as one of the most important lessons of his young life. He learned that true leadership meant using whatever power you had to protect and uplift those who couldn't protect themselves. He discovered that small gestures of respect and dignity could have enormous impacts on people's lives and performance. Most importantly, George learned that being born into a position of privilege and authority carried with it the responsibility to ensure that others were treated with fairness and respect. The lesson would stay with him throughout his life and would shape his approach to royal duty when he eventually became king. The story of Prince George's intervention at the Royal Guards Barracks became something of a legend within military circles, told and retold as an example of how true nobility revealed itself through concern for others rather than simply through titles and ceremony. It was a reminder that even a 10-year-old boy could make a profound difference in the lives of others when he combined compassion with courage and used his position to serve rather than to be served.